Hello again, guys. It is I, Freeze700. We are back with some Warhammer 40K lore, or should I say 30K. Here we are talking about the Imperial Army, also known as the Imperial Militia, also known as the Imperialis Auxilia. It's been known as a lot of things. But what we're going to be going over is mostly its organization, how it was different from the 40K Imperial Guard. So, let's start right off. So the Imperial Army was around Warhammer 30K, and as we all know, Warhammer 30K religion was illegal. We also know that there's a few fundamental differences in the way the regiments were run. Like, well, in Warhammer 40K, the Imperial Guard is the front line. They are the ones who always initiate the war, they're always the ones who are fighting the war, they're the ones always defending, always attacking, doing everything. And the Space Marines just kind of come in whenever they get the chance. Well, in Warhammer 30K, it's totally different. So in Warhammer 30K, the Imperial Guard was actually made, not Imperial Guard, the Imperial Army was made a little bit after the Crusade was already kind of started. Now, I know everyone's going to say, what about the old 100 that existed on Terra before the Imperial Crusade even began? Well, yes, technically that is true. Technically, the Imperial Army did exist a little bit before Warhammer 30K, but it's kind of a mystery as to how much went on, especially since Thunder Warriors were said to do most of the major lifting. And then they retconned that and kind of said, well, there were Proto-Astartes. Then they kind of retconned and now they're saying there's Proto-Astartes, Thunder Warriors, and the old 100 still there. I'm sticking more to the idea that it was mostly the Thunder Warriors doing most of the work. But yeah, there was definitely the old 100. Like we see the good old Geno 5-2 Chiliad, who definitely existed. So, speaking about that, so the Geno 5-2 Chiliad, they were one of the oldest Imperial regiments that existed. Now, this is a perfect example of what the Imperial Army was in its organization. It was totally different. So, essentially what it was every regiment had its own choice of rank, its own choice of doctrines, its own choice of technology, its own choice of weaponry, its own choice of everything. In other words, in Warhammer 40K, an Imperial Guardsman has to follow by the edicts and the codes and all the standards that the rest of the Imperial Guard is following. So everyone has to have a lasgun, everyone has to have a flak vest, everyone has to have this, stuff like that. To crack grenades, to bang grenades, all stuff like that. Well, when it comes to the Imperial Army, there's actually more room of customization in there. So the Geno 5-2 Chiliad was an Imperial Army that used a lot of genetic enhancements and would have only female officers. And their armor was more or less, it was flak vest, but it looked more like ancient Russian type builds, and all their troops had to be super tall humans who would be around, 7 feet, 6 feet tall. Then they would also use some genetic stealing to steal the best genes from their opponents and to just kind of scour through recruits and see what genes they had and implement them in their own legion. Not legion, army, their regiment. This is totally different from Warhammer 40K. So in Warhammer 40K, you have a few regiments that are different, like the Mordian Iron Guard. They're disciplined, they never retreat. Then you have the Katakin jungle fighters, who are really good saboteurs, able to withstand jungles, but they're very few and far in between. You're rarely going to see them. You're most likely just going to see regular PDF forces. The Imperial Army was much different. The Imperial Army was your standard rule. You were just going to see them pretty much with every fighting force, and they were going to be on every planet, but every single one of them was going to be totally fucking different. They made no sense. So if you were a war boss, an orc war boss, and you defeated many regiments, you would start saying, whoa, none of these guys are the same. You got some of them who are gene crafted. You have some of them who are cybernetically augmented. You have some of them who are just feral warriors. Then you have some of them who are just abhumans straight up. So that's exactly the way the Imperial Militia was. You have different themes of war, or as they call it, provenances of war. And because of that, you'd see various weapons inside the organization itself. So, let's talk about the weapons. So, Warhammer 30K, the weapons were mostly guns, auto guns. But the issue is that there was no, standard model, like the lasgun. Lasgun's a standard model. In Warhammer 30K, not so much. And to make this even worse, the Imperial Regiments, some of them would be from like Feral World, so they would just use muskets. I'm not joking, this is something that I see sometimes in tabletop, is someone will just use like an not Age of Sigmar, but Warhammer Fantasy musket model, and they'll just throw it in their army of gene-crafted warriors and say, yeah, you know, this guy's a feral warrior. So here you go, you got a guy with a musket who's gene-crafted, so he looks like a fucking dwarf with a fucking musket. So he's super strong and high initiative, but then he's even more nutty because he has one extra attack because he's feral. So that was the fun thing about this army, is that you could kind of mix and match and customize shit, and you would see shit that was just flat out ridiculous. Now, when it came to their vehicles, though, that's where you see the vehicles is much, much greater. So, here we go. So when it comes to the vehicles in the regiments, it's not like Warhammer 40K. The Imperial Guard regiments are limited. If I am a regiment, I am only allowed to specialize in one of a few fields. I can either be all vehicles, I could either be artillery, or I could be infantry. I couldn't be anything else. If I was one thing, I had to stick to it. In the Imperial Army, this was very different. The Imperialis Auxilia was highly different. If you were a regiment, you were allowed all tools at your disposal. You could be infantry with Lehman Russ tanks escorting it and have your own mortars to back you up. They even had Malcador tanks, which was very common back in this day. They had a lot of tanks back in these days. Whereas in 40K, it was more... So in Warhammer 40K, you wouldn't be seeing this much vehicles. Whereas back then, you would see a lot of them. And of course, when it came to the armor of these troops, the armor would vary very much. As much as you would say the armor in the vehicles. So when it came to some of their commanders, like the super elite organization inside the Imperial Army had a second organization of the Solar Auxilia. And the Solar Auxilia were super elite. They were more like your equivalent in Halo, known as the ODSTs. They were the ones who wore carapace armor. And sometimes they wore power armor. Sometimes they would just stick to just straight up carapace armor most of the time. But they would use super advanced guns. They would use the Auxilia Las carbine, the Auxilia Las rifle, which was way better than the Las gun by just a few range. They would use the Auxilia pistol, which had better range and the same damage as a fucking rifle. It was nutty, the shit that these guys had. Their carapace armor, though, was actually really unique in that if they ever got blasted out into the void, they could survive for just a few seconds. Just a few. But that's pretty impressive. They're actually well-equipped, well-armed, and they formed Las rifle sections where they would just basically mow down their opponent with these Las carbines. And these Las carbine sections would usually consist around 20 troops. Usually. As again, there is some fluctuation. There is no real standard to the Imperial Army. So let's say you teleport back in time and you're like, oh, okay, I'm in Warhammer 30K. Where's all this army that you're talking about, Fraser? I'm seeing mostly Space Marines. Well, that's where we're going to get into the role of the Imperial Army, or also known as the Imperial Militia, and the Imperial Auxilius. So, here in Warhammer 30K, Space Marines did most of the heavy lifting. But the Imperial Army was the reserve force. They were the garrison. They were also the backup. They were mostly just held in as a support group. They would always come in with the Astartes, if the Astartes wished, and they would provide just that, just mortar support, tank support, vehicle. That's pretty much it. Now, as far as their organization, like who commanded them, usually this was left to the Space Marines or the Primarch, but more commonly it was left to just one human commander who would command both the fleet and the ground forces. That is super different in the Imperial Guard. In the Imperial Guard, these are two separate branches in the military. Whereas in Warhammer 30K, as long as you're a general, you can lead the Armada and the ground forces, and that's really, really ridiculous. Now, it's even more crazy that a Space Marine can order their troops around, because usually in Warhammer 40K, the Space Marines just kind of give them hints, Or they'll tell guardsmen around them, all right, follow me, and they'll lead the charge. But aside from that, they don't have any real authority over the Imperial Guard. But in the Imperial Army, back in Warhammer 30K, this is much different. And this time, Space Marines actually did command, and this time, Primarchs actually did command, and this time, if you were a general and you were commanding troops, you were also commanding space battles. So this is where it was a lot of power given to individuals, whereas in Warhammer 40K, things are so divided, so broken up, that if you ever went traitor, you wouldn't have that much at your disposal. If I went traitor, I'd only have myself and the soldiers behind me. But in Warhammer 30K, if you went traitor, you had your army, you had your armada, you had a lot of vehicle support. You were really set to dig yourself in and build up a pretty high trench. But of course, you had to deal with the hundreds of thousands of Astartes breaking down your fucking door and kicking your ass. So that's why a lot of people didn't go traitor. Now, something else that's very interesting in this time is that there was no commissars. Commissars didn't exist. So instead they had iterators, who were mostly with the remembrancers, to mostly spread propaganda, making sure that people remembered what they saw in the correct light. So if I was a winter soldier or winter guard, and I was fighting on a world where I saw just nasty situations like Imperial Guardsmen stepping on alien babies and just slaughtering innocents, that iterator would be sure that I recognize this as not innocent aliens. No. They started a war with us. These were the people who backed their soldiers. These are the people who resulted in my brothers dying. So that's the whole role of the iterator. But they also had a few other disciplinary groups inside, but none of them were ever close to the commissar, because the commissar is more or less like a death squadron. If he saw something wrong, he would just shoot you right then and there. In Warhammer 30K, you don't have that severity. They would punish you, they would discipline you, but never and ever would they ever just flat out kill you in front of everyone else. That's very rare that they would ever do that. Now, mind you, human life is exactly worth nothing in the Imperial Army still, but it isn't that crazy zealous, that crazy fanatic that drives their army. Instead, what drives their army is, well, materialism. They're fighting for a crusade. They're trying to claim worlds. They're trying to expand the Imperium. They don't fight because it's their religion. They don't fight because they feel morally obligated to. No. They're fighting because this is a crusade. They have to take over as much as they can to unite all of Terra. This, of course, doesn't settle with some of the remembrancers, but that's okay because that's what the iterators are for. Now, this Imperial Army did form Expeditionary Fleets, and there was somewhere around 4,600 Expeditionary Fleets, and that's crazy by the end of the Crusade. That is insane. But as far as like their whole effectiveness in battle, they're actually pretty much the same as the Imperial Guard. Every time the Imperial Army would fight, you'd always see casualties, 40,000, 100,000, 1 million. And that's mostly due to the same fact, that they're just normal humans standing their ground, fighting tooth and nail with aliens that are bigger, aliens that are better, the aliens that are stronger, aliens that are smarter, when humanity's just not that well equipped against these kinds of threats. Hell, even the Space Marines, who are super augmented humans, who to the point that they're not even human anymore, even they get some nasty casualties from these forces. So that's kind of where the Imperial Army stands as far as strength. But around the end of it, around 20 to 25% of it, of their army, consisted of those veterans, the Solar Auxilia, as I mentioned. The ones who wore the crazy fucking armor that could actually survive the void. The awesome fucking las carbine guns that could kick some ass. Besides that, though, that's pretty much it about the Imperial Auxilia, the Imperial Army. Besides that, I hope you guys enjoyed. See you guys next time. The next video upload is going to be the next Roommates Undivided video, and I hope to see you guys there. Besides that, see you guys next time.